Topic is photography, poetry, and black performances. By the end of this session, you want to be able to define these terms. You want to use the source sheet to figure out the summary of the documents. You're going to be using a blank sheet of paper to complete several tasks. On a blank sheet of paper, you're going to create these lines, this grid, and you're going to respond to the task as you see them in the slideshow. We're going to be looking at a couple of photographs, and this is going to reference Harlem from the Harlem Renaissance. Notice the term Black Harlemites, James Van Der Zee, and what he's trying to do is change the perception of white Americans and the perception they have of Black Americans. We also have W.E.B. Du Bois coming up once again. He has a collection of photographs that are being displayed. And this is task number 1 that you want to complete. How could photographs change the perception of Black Americans living during the Roaring Twenties? I've also included the vicious cycle. And the thing we want to focus on here is the possible belief in inferiority that can develop within the African American thought process as a result of some of the images that we see, which is the whole point of James Van Der Zee trying to challenge that particular perception. And as we look at the African American experience in America during the 1920s, as we get close to the Harlem Renaissance, we'll see this term come up several times, this new Negro movement that is starting to emerge. And in this case, the new Negro movement is trying to use photographs, as we said before, to change that particular perception. There is something called the old versus the new Negro, as they mentioned down here. And what they're trying to do is look at Black expression, trying to look at Black history and things like that, which is a reversal because in the 1800s, the old Negro was concerned primarily with the abolition of slavery. So the 1800s in comparison to the 1900s are definitely two different decades with two different experiences. So in this slide, how they see us, we see the caricature of Jim Crow from the 1800s, and then I've used this image of Al Jolson, who is in blackface. Al Jolson was a famous actor in the early 1900s, starred in the movie The Jazz Singer, among others, and of course the work of Stepin Fetchit. And Stepin Fetchit is an interesting individual because notice the year 1934. Keep in mind that Hollywood is going to own all of the infrastructure, and they're the ones who are going to be the writers and the producers. And what kind of role are you going to be able to get as a Black actor? As we click this link, you will see some of the work of this particular individual. So we want to keep focusing on how they see us as we look at the photographs. Task 2, link the perception to the vicious cycle. What I'm trying to do is link the cycle to these particular images. And we want to think about this section here, this belief in inferiority, and how that belief of inferiority can develop as you see these negative portrayals of your particular people. Task 3, and the first photograph by James Van Der Zee. And the task we want to figure out or question: after reviewing the next series of images on the slides, determine if the photographs achieve the goal of changing white perceptions of Black Americans. I'm asking you to make a judgment about whether or not these images are enough to challenge the perception that already is out there in mainstream America. And then you also want to think about how these negative and positive portrayals are going to impact the vicious cycle. Here we have another image of a Black family. They use the term Garveyite. Garveyite is a reference to Marcus Garvey, who was advocating in the early 1900s for a return back to Africa. So here we have a positive portrayal. And what does this positive portrayal do to challenge such negative images? Harlem is going to come up again, that mass exodus that we'll be looking at a later section. The year is 1925, and we have a group of children who are swimming. And this seems to be a normal portrayal of, a activity. And, it's going to challenge how they see us. because you don't really see any of these negative portrayals among the group of children who are just here. Here we have a Harlem couple, the year 1932. Notice the vehicle as well as the luxury items. And this definitely is going to challenge that negative portrayal, because we're looking at two individuals who have to have some amount of money in order to achieve this particular status, which is the whole point of this photo, is to show some of those luxury items, to challenge the image of poverty that is mainstream for this time period. Here we have another image. And again, the goal is to say, this is not us. This is how you see us. This is how we actually are. It's all about trying to challenge that negative. Here we have a group of cadets challenging that portrayal. Task 4, complete this on the sheet of paper. Consider Stepin Fetchit as an entertainer. What options did he have to challenge stereotypes? As I mentioned before, African Americans are not in control of the entertainment industry, and they are going to be limited to some of the roles that they are able to get, which is possibly going to put them in a position where they are portraying their own group in a negative way. Part of the Harlem Renaissance is also to look back to Africa. Africa in the 1800s fell to European colonialism as a result of the Berlin Conference. If you are unfamiliar with that, Africa was cut up into sections and the European powers took a chunk, and that's going to last until the end of World War II. But what's starting to happen is that new Negro is starting to look back to Africa and make some connections between slavery and colonialism, treatment of Europeans with regard to Africans throughout European and African history. Some Harlem Renaissance poets use imagery to counter the negative stereotypes. So we've looked at photos. In a minute, we're going to start looking at some of the poetry. And those poets are trying to establish some sort of African identity. The first source you're going to analyze as one of these poets is this one right here, Envisioning Africa. Task 5, you want to translate the poem. And to give you a couple of hints here, Hidden by a Minstrel Smile. A minstrel show is a reference to 1800 films where white actors put on blackface to portray black actors. Remember, the whole point of this section is to look at the negative as well as positive portrayal of African Americans. Heritage, Task 6. You want to explore the relationship between Africa and African American identity. And what you want to look for as you're analyzing this particular poem here is how Countee Cullen is making a connection with regard to Africa. And he keeps asking this question, what is Africa to me? It's the same task for Task 6. What is Africa to me? And what they're trying to do here is look at Africa and trying to establish some sort of connection, some sort of identity with Africa, because these African Americans living in America are really at a disadvantage with regard to how they're being portrayed, and that is reinforcing that negative perception, which then when we look back at the vicious cycle, reinforces that belief in inferiority. So on some level, I have to recognize that this is becoming problematic, and so the thought process here is if we can return back to Africa, embrace that culture, that is going to uplift us as a group of people. We have another section. In this section, a reference to a double part. Could that be a link to double consciousness? As Du Bois mentioned, the two Americas that exist. He mentions here, heart growing sick. The people he's serving are not black. If the person he was serving was black, that might be evidence of advancement for his people. All day long and all night through, one thing only I must do, quench my pride and cool my blood. This individual is being silenced, possibly not in a position to advocate for his people, and understands that, the African American is in a disadvantage, possibly as a second class citizen, and he's aware of that. As we transition from poetry to music, we'll be talking about jazz, blues, and gospel. Treat these as definitions. Blues rooted in slavery, jazz, all of these music genres are part of that great migration, because as African Americans leave and go into those cities, they are bringing their culture, their way of life, their speech patterns, and in this case, their music. Clicking this link will take you to this particular performance here. Some required images. Here we're looking at Ethel Waters, the woman in Cabin in the Sky. The year is 1943, so it's a little outside of the Harlem Renaissance. This link will take you to the trailer. And the significance here is it's an all-black musical. So what we're starting to see here, the trend of blackface is starting to go away, as we're starting to see black actors achieve some performances and jobs that are not negative and that are not reinforcing stereotypes. Cast of Cabin in the Sky, all black cast, definitely something that is significant. Nobody is in blackface. Black actors are starting to be employed. And we have another image from Cabin in the Sky, and we want to keep coming back to this idea. This is how they see us. We are going to have to portray ourselves differently to try to challenge these negative perceptions, or these negative perceptions are going to reinforce prejudice, discrimination, which then leads to those social disadvantages, and the end result will be a belief in inferiority. For Task 7, we're going to make a connection between present day issues, negative portrayal of African Americans, in comparison to the issues that are outlined in this slideshow with regard to some of the images from the Harlem Renaissance, as well as the negative portrayal of African Americans. So we're going to be looking at a couple of clips here. The first three come from a movie called Hollywood Shuffle, which was written, produced, paid for by this actor here, who is Robert Townsend. Robert Townsend apparently could not get any financing from any studio, so he financed the film on his own. The premise behind the film is that he is a black actor and he's trying to acquire a legitimate role, but the only roles he is able to get are roles of criminals or a slave. In the 1970s, there was something called blaxploitation films, which looked at inner city African American communities, and they were always portrayed as either drug dealers or criminals. And in this section right here, Black Acting School, the main character finds himself in a black acting school where they're learning how to play stereotypical black characters. Scene 3, Act More Black. He has a job as a actor, and the director keeps telling him to act more black. I selected a scene from Seinfeld because in the scene they reference Al Jolson, the individual we have mentioned several times, and then these two clips here, which are about Good Times. Good Times was a show in the 1970s that was about a black family living in Cabrini Green, Chicago, and for the most part it was a positive show. The the father in this series would always complain to the writers that they needed to go away from negative portrayals of African Americans, and then he was written out, I think, at the end of the second season. Netflix, for some reason in 2024, remade the show into a cartoon, and there's been a lot of criticism about that decision by Netflix. At the end of this class, you want to be able to identify, summarize these terms. For the most part, we looked at images as well as poems, 2 poems. And if you want to verify your definitions, you can use this slide.